Russia believed this war would be quick and easy. The Kremlin told its people that Ukraine would collapse under Russia's military power, but that never happened. Instead, the conflict dragged on, and now something unexpected is happening inside Russia itself. Some regional lawmakers are openly admitting that the war has failed. Fear and confusion are spreading, and officials are starting to say that this war, which has now lasted longer than Russia's fight in World War II, may be one Putin cannot win. One of the loudest voices speaking out is 69-year-old regional politician Grigory Yeremayev. He has lived through the height of the Soviet Union, its collapse, and Putin's rise to power. After 4 years of fighting in Ukraine, Yeremayev stood before his fellow lawmakers and said something bold. The war has not achieved any of its goals, and those goals are no longer realistic. If you're enjoying this video, make sure you subscribe, because you're doing the right thing so you won't miss any update from this channel. Yeremayev made it clear that Russia cannot win this war. He also suggested that Putin continues fighting because stopping now would mean admitting defeat. According to reports from RFU News on February 5th, Yeremayev told colleagues that the war's objectives are not just unmet, they are impossible to reach. That statement alone challenges the official story coming from the Kremlin. Speaking out in Russia is dangerous. Amnesty International has reported that peaceful critics of the war often face serious charges. The government frequently accuses them of crimes like inciting hatred or even treason. While it may be harder to silence a lawmaker who spoke inside a parliament building, the Kremlin still found a way to respond. Yeremayev was later fined 30,000 rubles, about $388, for allegedly abusing press freedoms, a charge that many see as ironic in a country where media restrictions are tight and independent voices are often silenced. What makes Yeremayev's speech powerful is not just what he said, but where he said it. He stood in front of colleagues who largely support Putin or depend on him for their careers. Instead of inspiring a wave of rebellion, many lawmakers tried to shut him down. They shouted over him, covered his microphone, and cut his audio. That moment showed how strongly the government tries to control the narrative. This isn't normal political debate. It's about maintaining power and suppressing uncomfortable truths. Even so, Yeremayev's message got through. He argued that the war has become a grinding destruction of lives and futures. He reportedly said that propaganda and daily civilian deaths have become common. Those are strong words, and they directly challenge Putin's leadership. Whether or not more lawmakers publicly agree, it's likely many quietly share his concerns. When we look at the bigger picture, the numbers raise serious questions. The war has now lasted longer than the Soviet Union's fight against Nazi Germany in World War II. Reports say that Russia is losing an average of around 1,000 soldiers per day. That's a staggering number for a conflict that was supposed to be short and decisive. In World War II, the Soviet Union eventually pushed enemy forces all the way to Berlin. In Ukraine, Russia's territorial gains have been far smaller and far slower. By the end of World War II, Soviet forces had pushed hundreds of miles west. In Ukraine, Russia's advances have been limited. At its peak in early 2022, Russia controlled about 26% of Ukraine, including Crimea. Years later, that number has reportedly dropped to just over 20%. After massive casualties, estimated at over 1 million combined dead and wounded, Russia holds less territory than it did early in the invasion. That is a serious strategic setback. Meanwhile, Ukraine has carried out drone strikes deep inside Russian territory, something that did not happen to the Soviet Union after it turned the tide in World War II. The fact that attacks are reaching hundreds of miles into Russia shows that the war is not contained. It has exposed weaknesses that many Russians were told did not exist. International leaders have also pointed out how Putin's goals have backfired. Instead of pulling Ukraine closer to Russia, the war pushed Ukraine closer to Europe. Instead of weakening NATO, it expanded. Finland and Sweden joined the alliance, and European defense spending has increased. In simple terms, several of Putin's main objectives appear to have produced the opposite results. Russia's economy is also under strain. The war has required massive government spending, and growth projections remain low. The International Monetary Fund has predicted slow growth in the coming years. Oil sales continue, but often at discounted prices. At the same time, Russia faces long-term population challenges, and heavy battlefield losses only add to that problem. Putin likely hoped that controlling Ukraine's vast natural resources would strengthen Russia financially. Instead, the country is dealing with rising costs and limited returns. Peace talks have not delivered the quick gains the Kremlin may have expected either. Reports suggest negotiations remain stalled, and Russia has not secured full control over regions like the Donbas. That leaves Putin in a difficult position. Ending the war without major gains could look like defeat. Continuing it drains resources and risks even more losses. Analysts argue that Putin is deeply focused on his legacy. He's often described the collapse of the Soviet Union as a historic injustice and sees himself as restoring Russia's greatness. But this war may define him in the opposite way. Instead of rebuilding an empire, it may weaken Russia's global standing and increase its dependence on countries like China. Some European policy experts have noted that Russia's economic relationship with China has become unbalanced, with Moscow increasingly reliant on Beijing. In my view, what stands out most is not just the military setbacks, but the cracks appearing inside Russia's political system. When lawmakers begin speaking openly about failure, even if they are punished, it shows that the pressure is real. Wars are not just fought on battlefields. They are fought in public opinion, in economies, and inside government institutions. Once doubt spreads among insiders, it becomes harder to control. Yeremayev may be just one voice for now, but history shows that major shifts often begin with a single person willing to speak uncomfortable truths. The longer the war continues without clear success, the harder it will be to silence those voices. Whether Putin can outlast that growing dissent remains to be seen. What is clear is that the conflict has reshaped Russia, Ukraine, and Europe in ways few predicted at the start, and not in the way the Kremlin promised. As the pressure builds inside Russia, the situation on the battlefield continues to move in ways that do not favor the Kremlin. Ukrainian forces have adapted, using technology and strategy to offset Russia's larger size. One major example is the expanded use of drone kill zones, where coordinated strikes target Russian troops and equipment with precision. These tactics are not just slowing Russia's advances, they are raising the cost of every inch of territory gained. Reports suggest that Russian recruitment is struggling to keep up with losses. Even when hundreds of thousands are brought in, casualty numbers remain extremely high. That creates a dangerous cycle. More troops are sent in, more losses follow, and the public is told everything is under control. But over time, the truth becomes harder to hide. Families feel the loss, communities see the absence, and the economic burden grows heavier. Inside Russia, even pro-war commentators have started facing pressure. Some military bloggers and analysts who once strongly supported the invasion are now being labeled as foreign agents simply for criticizing how the war is being handled. When even loyal voices are punished for pointing out mistakes, it suggests the leadership is feeling cornered. Control over the message becomes more important than solving the actual problems. At the same time, Ukraine has strengthened its ties with Europe and the West. Military aid, intelligence sharing, and economic support have kept Ukraine standing far longer than many predicted. What was supposed to be a quick campaign has turned into a long and costly war of endurance. And wars of endurance test not only armies, but political systems and national will. Financially, Russia faces ongoing strain. Heavy military spending leaves less room for healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Growth remains weak, and sanctions limit access to global markets. While Russia continues to sell oil and maintain trade with certain partners, it does so under increasing pressure. Long-term economic damage can be slower to notice than battlefield losses, but it can be just as serious. Another key factor is Russia's growing reliance on China. Strategic partnerships can be helpful, but dependence is different. If China decides to adjust its priorities or protect its own economic interests, Russia could find itself with fewer options. That imbalance puts Moscow in a weaker negotiating position globally. From my perspective, the biggest shift is psychological. At the start of the war, the message from Moscow was confidence and certainty. Now the tone feels defensive. When leaders have to silence critics, find lawmakers, and manage growing dissatisfaction, it signals vulnerability. Power that feels secure does not need to shout down debate. Putin may believe that time is on his side, that Ukraine or the West will eventually tire. But time cuts both ways. The longer the war drags on, the more it reshapes Russia's economy, military, and political stability. Every additional month without a decisive victory reinforces the argument made by voices like Yeremayev, that this war cannot achieve what it originally promised. In the end, the conflict has become more than a territorial dispute. It is now about legacy, survival, and the future direction of Russia itself. If dissent continues to grow inside parliament and beyond, Putin may face pressure not just from outside forces, but from within his own system. And history shows that internal pressure can be the most difficult to control. The war that was meant to restore strength may instead expose weakness. And if the current trends continue, battlefield struggles, economic strain, diplomatic setbacks, and rising internal criticism, the question may no longer be whether Russia can win, but how long it can sustain the cost of trying. As the war moves forward, the long-term consequences are becoming harder to ignore. Russia is not just facing military challenges. It is facing a slow shift in its global position. Countries that once stayed neutral are choosing sides. Defense budgets across Europe are rising. NATO is stronger and more united than it was before the invasion. Instead of weakening Western alliances, the war appears to have strengthened them. Ukraine, on the other hand, has transformed. What began as a desperate defense has turned into a determined, organized resistance backed by international support. Its military has gained experience, adapted to modern warfare, and used technology in creative ways. The longer the war continues, the more Ukraine builds that experience. That makes any future Russian advances even more difficult and costly. At home, Russia faces another problem: fatigue. Wars that drag on for years wear down public morale. Even in tightly controlled political systems, frustration can grow quietly. Rising prices, limited economic growth, and the constant stream of casualties create pressure that cannot be hidden forever. While state media may continue to project confidence, everyday reality can tell a different story. There's also the issue of demographics. Russia was already facing population decline before the invasion. Large-scale military losses only make that challenge worse. Over time, fewer working-age citizens means slower economic growth and greater strain on social systems. These are not short-term problems. They shape a nation's future for decades. In many ways, Putin now faces a difficult dilemma. If he escalates, the risks grow even higher: more losses, more sanctions, and greater isolation. If he pulls back without clear gains, it could look like a major defeat. That is the trap critics like Yeremayev are pointing to. The war has boxed Russia into a corner where every option carries serious costs. From my perspective, the most telling sign is how the conversation inside Russia is slowly changing. Even if open opposition remains limited, the fact that it exists at all inside official institutions matters. History shows that once leaders begin to lose unquestioned support among insiders, stability becomes harder to maintain. The world is also watching closely. Global markets, diplomatic relationships, and security alliances are adjusting based on how this conflict unfolds. Russia's image as a dominant military power has been challenged. Whether fair or not, perception plays a huge role in international influence, and perception has shifted. At this stage, the war is no longer about a quick victory or a limited objective. It has become a defining chapter for Russia's leadership and its place in the world. The costs, human, economic, and political, continue to rise. If current trends hold, the future may bring even more pressure from within Russia itself. What started as a show of strength has turned into a prolonged test of endurance. And endurance wars do not just measure weapons and territory, they measure leadership, strategy, and national resilience. The coming months and years will reveal whether Russia can withstand that test, or whether internal strain will force a turning point. As the conflict stretches further into its fifth year, the reality on the ground continues to challenge the image the Kremlin tries to present. Russian forces may still control significant territory, but control alone does not equal victory. Holding land requires constant manpower, supply lines, and money, and all three are under strain. The longer the war drags on, the more expensive it becomes, not just financially, but socially and politically. One major issue is sustainability. Military analysts have pointed out that modern warfare consumes equipment at a shocking rate. Tanks, armored vehicles, artillery systems, and ammunition are being used faster than they can easily be replaced. While Russia has large stockpiles from the Soviet era, much of that equipment is outdated. Refurbishing it takes time and money. Meanwhile, Ukraine continues receiving advanced systems from Western allies. That technological gap matters more with each passing month. Another growing concern is morale. At the beginning of the invasion, Russian leadership projected confidence. The expectation was that Ukraine would fold quickly and that resistance would collapse. Instead, Ukrainian forces regrouped, mobilized, and adapted. For Russian soldiers on the ground, fighting a prolonged war with no clear end date can take a serious mental toll. High casualty numbers only deepen that strain. Recruitment has become increasingly difficult. Offering financial incentives may attract volunteers in the short term, but it does not solve deeper issues. When communities repeatedly see young men leaving and not returning, support can quietly erode. Even in a tightly controlled media environment, word of mouth spreads. Families talk. Soldiers communicate. The human cost cannot be hidden forever. Economically, the pressure is steady. Russia has managed to avoid total collapse, but stagnation is not success. Growth forecasts remain weak, and sanctions continue to limit access to advanced technology and financial markets. The government has redirected large portions of the national budget toward defense spending. That means fewer resources for social programs and long-term development. Over time, that trade-off can weaken the country's foundation. Energy exports remain a lifeline, but selling oil at discounted prices reduces profit margins. At the same time, alternative buyers have leverage. If key partners decide to negotiate harder or shift suppliers, Russia's income could take another hit. This imbalance creates vulnerability. A strong economy can absorb the shock of war. A strained one struggles to keep pace. On the diplomatic front, Russia finds itself more isolated than before the invasion. While it still maintains relationships with certain nations, its influence in Europe has clearly declined. Instead of dividing Western countries, the war has pushed them closer together. NATO's expansion stands as a direct example. Finland and Sweden joining the alliance reshaped the security landscape in Northern Europe. That development alone contradicts one of the war's original justifications. Ukraine, meanwhile, has strengthened its international position. Its cooperation with European institutions has deepened. Military coordination has improved. The country has also gained symbolic support as a nation defending its sovereignty. That narrative has resonated globally. Whether one agrees with every aspect of the conflict or not, Ukraine's ability to survive has shifted perceptions. From a strategic standpoint, Russia's territorial gains have not translated into decisive leverage. Capturing and holding cities is only one part of war. Maintaining supply chains, protecting long borders, and defending against counterattacks require constant effort. Ukrainian drone operations reaching deep into Russian territory demonstrate that the battlefield is not one-sided. Psychological impact matters too. When attacks reach inside your borders, it changes the national conversation. Another overlooked factor is time. Wars of this scale reshape societies. Children grow up during conflict. Economies restructure around military production. Public expectations shift. The longer the war lasts, the harder it becomes to return to normalcy. Even if fighting stopped tomorrow, rebuilding trust, infrastructure, and economic balance would take years. Putin's leadership now faces a delicate balancing act. On one side is the need to appear strong and unwavering. On the other is the reality that resources are not unlimited. Ending the war without major gains could damage his image. Continuing it indefinitely risks further internal and external strain. That is the strategic trap critics describe. There's also the question of legacy. Leaders who launch large-scale wars are often remembered primarily for those decisions. If the outcome falls short of expectations, history can be unforgiving. Putin has frequently referenced restoring Russia's greatness and correcting what he sees as historical wrongs. But the war's consequences may instead define his era as one of prolonged conflict and economic challenge. Internally, small cracks can widen over time. A single lawmaker speaking out may not change policy immediately. But dissent has a way of spreading quietly. When one voice challenges the official narrative, it signals to others that disagreement exists. Even if those voices remain cautious, the psychological shift matters. Information control has limits. In today's connected world, even restricted media environments cannot fully isolate citizens from outside perspectives. News travels through private conversations, online platforms, and personal networks. Controlling the story becomes more complicated the longer the war continues. Another long-term risk is military fatigue. Equipment wears down. Soldiers rotate in and out. Command structures face pressure. Every campaign requires coordination and morale. Sustaining that effort over years without decisive progress can weaken operational effectiveness. Ukraine's strategy appears focused on endurance and attrition, making the cost of occupation too high. If that strategy succeeds, Russia faces a difficult calculation. How much more cost is acceptable? How much longer can momentum be maintained without a breakthrough? Financial institutions have also adjusted expectations. International forecasts show modest growth at best. That is not collapse, but it is far from prosperity. A nation engaged in prolonged war typically needs strong economic expansion to offset losses. Slow growth limits flexibility. Demographic challenges remain a quiet but serious issue. An aging population combined with wartime losses reduces the workforce. That affects productivity, tax revenue, and social stability. Over a decade or more, those trends compound. From my point of view, the most critical factor may be patience. Ukraine and its allies appear willing to wait, believing that time favors them. If Russia cannot achieve a clear advantage soon, the burden shifts. Endurance becomes the deciding factor. And endurance is not just about soldiers, it is about society as a whole. The longer the war lasts, the more it reshapes global alignments. Countries in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa are recalculating partnerships based on shifting power dynamics. Russia's ability to project influence depends not only on military strength, but on economic credibility and diplomatic trust. At home, everyday Russians may not openly protest, but economic strain and uncertainty can influence public mood. Stability has long been a key pillar of Putin's leadership. If the war undermines that sense of stability, even gradually, it introduces new political risks. Another key issue is technology. Modern warfare relies heavily on precision weapons, cyber capabilities, satellite intelligence, and rapid communication. Ukraine's access to advanced Western systems has allowed it to offset numerical disadvantages. Russia's ability to adapt technologically will play a major role in the coming years. Sanctions have also targeted high-tech components and financial networks. While workarounds exist, they often increase costs. Over time, reduced access to innovation can slow modernization efforts across multiple industries, not just defense. Peace negotiations remain uncertain. Diplomatic efforts require compromise, and compromise requires leverage. If neither side feels ready to concede, talks stall. That prolongs the conflict and reinforces the cycle of attrition. What stands out most is how different the situation looks compared to early 2022. Then, expectations of a rapid Russian victory were widespread. Now the focus is on survival, sustainability, and damage control. That shift alone signals how dramatically the conflict has evolved. Ultimately, wars reshape leaders as much as they reshape borders. The decisions made in the coming months could determine not only the outcome of this conflict, but also the future direction of Russia itself. Whether through continued fighting and negotiated settlement or internal political change, the consequences will echo for years. For now, the pattern is clear: prolonged conflict, rising costs, strategic uncertainty, and growing internal debate. The war that was meant to secure strength has instead created a complex web of military, economic, and political challenges, and with each passing day, the weight of those challenges increases. If current trends continue, pressure from inside Russia may grow alongside external challenges. History shows that sustained strain often leads to turning points, sometimes sudden, sometimes gradual. The question is not only how the war ends, but what Russia looks like when it does.